Hello, everyone. I clicked the button that put me up on stage here, and it was abrupt to me when I was on stage. Clearly, I am not prepared for this. Welcome everyone to the March JavaScript and Ruby meetup. I have some slides that I will bring up on my screen in a second here. I will continue to vamp while they come up. Oop, nope, wrong one. That was not my March slides. March slides. Ha, there we go. All right. Everybody can see my slides. Give me a message in the chat if you can. I'm assuming everyone can see my slides. Looks good. Excellent. Cool. Are my slide transitions working? They're working. Excellent. The last time I presented, I was unable to go from slide to slide, and it was extremely painful as I had to unshare and reshare every single slide. So welcome. We have kind of combined languages here. We have the JavaScript and Ruby communities. We've gotten together, organized together just so that we have a little bit more organizational strength behind us, because we see the value in these continuing presentations, meetups, and talks and things, and we wanted to make sure that we weren't burning out our organizers, because it's a little bit harder to do it in the COVID era. We're getting some good news there, potentially, lots of restrictions being lifted, but DES and the meetup communities are still not 100% certain what we're doing for that. It's probably going to be a discussion happening sometime in the next month. So kind of look out for that. But for now, we're going to continue to be online, which means that you'll hear me shill for organizers and talks at least once, probably a couple of times, depending on what slides are in here, because this community, these presentations are all really powered by the people involved. So if you enjoy this, I would encourage you to reach out to any of the organizers in the meeting currently. That would be myself. That would be Andy and Abram. Yeah, probably more than twice. Andy has heard me shill an awful lot. So you can reach out to myself, Abram, or Andy, and if you want to get involved, we'd be happy to have you. It's a lot less work than you think it is, and it keeps this community running. Sometimes just as simple as reminding people that there's going to be a meetup happening up, just so we have a good amount of people and we know that there's going to be some content there. What's on the agenda for today is, as always, a review of our code of conduct, some talk from news and Ruby and JavaScript, and then we'll get to some talks. And then if we have time at the end, there'll be kind of some socialization happening in the tables at Remo until about 8:30, when they'll kind of kick us out with our current account. So by attending this meetup, you agree to our code of conduct. It will be linked in the chat in a second by somebody, and if not, I will link it once we get to the talk section. Essentially, be kind, be patient, be awesome. We just want this to be a welcoming community that is as much for veteran JavaScript developers that know about things like object prototyping as much as it is new people as well. We want to make sure that all kinds of people, all experience levels, all cultures, all walks of life are welcome here. And so just be kind with people and make sure that you're being patient with all the new people, and just be awesome. When we were in person, we used to have these absolutely amazing little tiny stickers that would go on that would tell people your personal pronouns. And most importantly, we had this yellow sticker, which meant that you were a friendly face. You were someone who's used to talking to new people, used to answering dumb questions. And more than that, you were okay being approached by somebody who's there maybe for the first time, or someone who's a little bit shyer. So in the absence of these yellow icons, these little yellow stickers, I usually call out myself as somebody you can always come talk to. I'm on the Slack. I'm in the chat. I'm on your screen right now. I'm in your ears, and I don't mind talking to anybody about this and letting them know what's up and answering any questions that people might have. We also have two channels that help support these two communities: Meetup-Ruby and Meetup-JavaScript. And those channels are great places to share Ruby and JavaScript knowledge, to get advice, to get help, to advance your skills, to get people's opinions. They're a great place to just kind of bask in the glory of other Ruby and JavaScript developers. So yeah, come talk, come reach out in the channels. You'll find those communities very welcoming and accepting. You will be on YouTube. I have clicked the button that says that we will record this, and then one of us will upload it to the DES YouTube afterwards. So anyone who's going to be giving a talk, just know that your face and name is going to be on YouTube, and I might read out some stuff on YouTube, or comments rather, and your screen name might be on YouTube. All right, getting to the news side of things. On the Ruby news, it looks like there's a whole bunch of different Man, that's 3 utterly different versions of Ruby that got released. It looks like they're still maintaining a couple of versions of Ruby. So new version of Ruby 7, Ruby 6, and Ruby 5. Rails has a new version, a latest bug fix for Rails 6.1. Small release for Ruby itself. And then Ruby Gems 3.3.8 was released. And apparently there's lots of drama between the DHH and the RailsConf leads to many core team exits, which is really interesting. Anytime that there's a any sort of core community or core language drama, those communities are surprisingly small. If you piss off a few people, you might lose half of your staff. It's surprising how few people are in charge of these sorts of really big kind of organizational groups. If anybody has there's a link that Annie just put into the drama there. In terms of JavaScript, the only news for JavaScript is that I did not get any JavaScript news on time to put in the slides. So that is our news for JavaScript for February. Oh, no. Oh, look. Wow. Look at Andy just proving me wrong. There was so much news. He cleverly broke it up into 2 different pages here. So we have TypeScript version 4.6 coming out. Node version 17.6 with support for loading ES modules over HTTPS. A new version of Jasmine came out because, yes, we all write tests. And then new versions of Remix and Next. And then some trademarks moving from Joyent to OpenJS, which is really interesting. And yes, coming out, I believe today, there was some changes to type annotations in JavaScript that were, I believe, proposed, but not. I don't think there's a path to it yet. But we had an interesting discussion about how the stronger types coming into JavaScript, a famously untyped kind of Wild West style language. So yeah, there's he types his comments. Yeah, real interesting stuff coming up. You might see beneath me, it says Dev Edmonton. You might have heard me mention DES before. So we are facilitated by the Dev Edmonton Society. That is a conglomeration of Edmonton developers. I like to use the word conglomeration because it implies like some element of congealing of like a weird organic growth. That's kind of what happened. It is a society of Edmonton developers that are trying to push the entirety of development at Edmonton forward. Typically, that's through empowering our community members, helping out meetups, helping organize conferences, making sure that we're having events that allow everyone to develop. So there are a couple of people from DES here today. Both myself and Abramson on the board, and Mark is hugely active in the community. Everybody else has probably come from our Slack or maybe come from Twitter or Meetup or something like that. So Dev Edmonton is a fantastic resource, a really interesting Slack group. And there's lots of different people to talk to, lots of collisions to be made there, and lots of opportunities as well. So I would go to devedmonton.com. You can check out our board, our mission, and get access to the Slack on that page. I would really encourage you to check out the Slack because Dev Edmonton is just a fantastic resource that more people should take advantage of. Speaking of Dev Edmonton, we have a regular meeting for the society. It happens on the second Wednesday of every single month. So the next one coming up will be on the 13th of April at 8 p.m. There's a Google Meet link. You can go to Dev Edmonton Society on Slack, the hashtag Dev Edmonton Society, and get the agenda and details. Most of the business of the society happens there, just in plain view of everyone, because we have nothing really to hide. And there's a survey as well that we're trying to push to get some information about what the people at Dev Edmonton are interested in and what's really kind of important to developers at large. All right. Our next meetup, don't worry, it's not over yet, is April 14th, 2022. They normally happen first Thursday of every month, but we've been doing second Thursday just because we've kind of gotten off cadence a little bit here. In May, we should probably be able to get back to first Thursday, but that'll depend a little bit on kind of organizational throughput, the velocity that we have, the ability for us to actually kind of get some of these things together. It's not insubstantial work to put these on, but it's not nothing either. All right. The last thing that I will say before we get to some talks, hoping that our first talk is going to get here, he's just logging on, is speakers. We need speakers. We need people to give talks. It's a fantastic way for someone who's a little bit kind of making their way or wants to kind of get their name out there or raise their profile to do that. especially if you're a new developer. We love having new developers come in and take us through something that they're learning as well. It's really interesting to see somebody's process, the way they do things, and just how they're drawing together the knowledge to kind of go through their career. Additionally, we also love people who get really deep in things. We have a really interesting talk from Mark today that's going to be all about hooks and stuff. He's going to take us through a bunch of the really more complicated examples. And so the scale of talks that we have could be anything from a demo, something interesting or fun that you built, maybe a capstone project if you're a student, all the way up to like a very complicated technical, let's all learn a lot about this really obscure topic. We've had talks on promises, we've had talks on AWS, we've had talks on Lambdas, all sorts of different things. If that interests you, you can always reach out to Andy, Abram, or myself. I would be happy to help facilitate your talk, including helping you like edit it and figure out what it should be about and kind of directing it. But you can also go to exchangejs.com/talks or yegrb.com/get involved and kind of enter in your kind of your talk idea there, at which point one of us will probably find you and we'll talk about your talk anyways. So use either way of reaching out. All right. I don't see our first person talking in here, so I think that I will encourage Mark to come to the stage. But if you have any questions, there's a wonderful Q&A section over there in Remo. I hope I'm pointing the right direction because on my screen, I'm pointing towards the Q&A section, and I hope that's the case on your screen. If you answer questions in there, I'll be actively moderating those questions, making sure that I answer them or ask them rather of our speakers. I think that one of our talks today is going to be a little bit more interactive, so we'll be looking for a lot of kind of participation there. If it makes sense to ask the question immediately, I will probably invite someone up to this. I'll probably pop in and just ask the question. And if it makes sense to take it to the end, I'll probably just kind of say, hey, I've heard your question, but we're going to answer that at the end. Mark, to get up to the stage, you should just be able to turn on your microphone or your camera, because as you are a speaker, you should have access to just, oh, look, there's a person. It's a Mark.
Woo! All right. The power of the internet. Awesome. Hey, hello, everybody. Hope you're all having a good night. This is like, we just said, this is a little bit of a different talk. It's going to kind of just be more of a guided discussion. It has come out of, I think it was last week, the team were doing a code review, and we spotted some weird bugs in some of our code. It was related to using, I think, reach router and some code getting triggered when locations changed that we didn't expect, and then not getting triggered at other times. And as we were looking through it, someone shared this really cool article that Dan Abbrov has written about writing a hook, a custom hook called setInterval. And in doing so, he kind of hits a bunch of weird edge cases as he goes through, which for me, I found really interesting because they really help you understand, how things like the React rendering cycle works and stuff like JavaScript closures, things like that. So this is a bit more of an advanced talk. If you are watching a recording of this or anything like that and are hoping to get the most out of it, I definitely encourage you to go look up what a JavaScript closure is, play around with it to understand a bit about how those work and how they bind. And also, do definitely kick the tires a little bit on React and React hooks if you haven't before. Otherwise, you may not get the most out of this. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to share a link here in the chat. This is a link to the article that I'm going to kind of follow through with. But I've got a code pen set up too where we're going to kind of recreate some of the code in here. So if you can take a moment, pull it up, bookmark it to read later. It is a bit of a head spin for new people. So take a look at that, and I will start sharing my screen here so you can see what I am seeing. All right. So I have to say too that Dan's blog's name, Overreacted, is great. I'm always a fan of developer puns, and I thought this was a pretty good one. So really quickly here, what he's doing is he's going to create a new hook called useInterval. And it works just like this. It's really sweet. It's a simple API. Basically, you pass in a callback and a timeout. And looking at it there, I mean, it's 4 lines of code. Looks pretty simple, right? There can't be that much going on. But it turns out there's actually quite a bit going on. So I'll dive into a little bit. Before we get too carried away, though, I'm going to show you guys this. So this is the final function that we're going to go through. we're going to be using a few different hooks. We'll use useState, useEffect, and useRef. So useState and useEffect are pretty common, ones that a lot of people may have used in the past. useRef is less frequently used, and to be honest, I think it's kind of underused. So I would recommend getting familiar with it, because especially if you're using effects and callbacks to code that doesn't understand the React rendering cycle, it can be really useful and an important way for making sure that that works. So let's dig into our code first and try to figure out what the error is. So if I pull this up, I'll hide that. And this is code for a simple counter. We're going to use setInterval, and the idea is that whenever it goes and renders, it's going to show a count, and then it's going to tick through that count. And there's a bug here that can be very subtle. So I'm going to ask quickly in the chat here if anyone can spot it, and take a moment to look at it. And then I don't want to make it too much of a guy yet. So I'm going to jump over here and show you in a moment what's going on. Before I do that, I'm just going to make sure. Yeah. So one more quick look. So we've got a useEffect. It sets an interval. At the end, it clears an interval. And, you know, you've got your cleanup function. You'd think for most effects that would work. So if we pull it up here, you can see when we render it, it's going to show 0. But the next thing that happens is nothing. It doesn't count. It doesn't tick or anything like that. Does anyone know why this is happening? This is honestly quite subtle. I did not see this at first. So it's not a lexical scoping issue. What it is it's actually weird. It's an interaction between the way setInterval works and the way that we're rendering here. So this is just an example of code where, you know, every 10th of a second, we're going and re-rendering our counter component. But you'll see this a lot in large apps. Before this talk, we were just kind of having a discussion there about how in large React apps, you'll often see rendering that can be triggered unexpectedly, and where it can often re-render the whole app. And often if you have things that are updating frequently, that can happen many times a second. And in this case, what we have is 10 times a second is updating here, rendering this component, and the component is going, and its effect is setting the interval for 1 second. But because it's being re-rendered multiple times a second, that interval never hits. It gets cleared every time that the component is unmounted. And when it's remounted, you don't see it because the interval never happens. So if I go in here, for example, and effect, you'll see that the effect is getting run a lot, 10 times a second. But you can see in here, counter never gets run. So, and that's because that interval never gets a chance to time out. It's being reset every time that effect runs. So we can come back here, and, you know, the simple approach is if we just increase this number even a little bit, you'll see that that will go and start running properly again in a moment. Oh. Or not, that was weird. 1 second. There we go. So if we have a larger timeout, it should still work. Yeah, and so you can see it's working intermittently here. Every couple seconds it's getting triggered just because of the overlap between re-rendering. If I bump that up to 2000, it should work properly. Yeah, so closer, but still not working very well. So we're going to fix that problem today and dig into it a little bit to understand why that's happening. And as we do that, we're going to a little bit about some of the different hooks and some of the different ways that you can use useEffect and useRef together to deal with issues like this and write awesome hooks that people on your team will love. So let's quickly jump in here and move this back to 100. And we're going to try this with Dan's solution first. So app 0 is our actual final target here. You can see it's working properly. And the cool thing is we actually have a delay here. So right now, it defaults to every second it counts, but you can pull it back down. And as it changes, you can see it dynamically updates that interval to correct the count. So, and it can go very fast. So that code looks just like this. This is using what Dan said there. It has the callback that we call in, and then it has the delay. And the cool thing is the delay here, it's just a state variable that we can update as we choose. So we're going to start digging into this, and we're going to try to recreate this ourselves. So back here, the first thing that we're going to do is we are going to go, 1 second, make sure I got my notes up. I'm going to cheat and use my code on the other screen here to make sure I'm doing what it's supposed to do. So the first thing that we're going to do in here is go and in our useEffect, if we come back here and update this. So every second it's getting called, we call that. So this is back to the original problem. The easiest way to fix it is to come in and make sure that that effect does not get retriggered. So you can go in here, and the typical thing you would do is update it so that the dependencies for useEffect are empty, right? And so what that does is the first time that the component is mounted, it will go trigger that effect, and then it won't trigger it again, or sorry, the cleanup again until that component is unmounted. So that allows us to call it once, but it's still not working, because if you come in here, what you'll see again, in here, you can see the effect is called once, but then the tick is actually getting called many times. So this function is actually getting called from that interval. But the challenge is that because it's only called once when the component first mounts, this function here, our tick, is defined right at the start when that component mounts. And when it mounts, it's going to go and close over the value of count. And the value of count during the first render is going to be 0. So every time this gets called, the value is going to be 0 plus 1, and it's continually going to be set again and again and again to 1. So you may actually see it ticking here a little bit. That's because of the hot reloading. If I clear that, you'll see it won't actually go up anymore. So an easy way to fix it, if you're within a component, is just to go and do something like this. Update your dependencies, fixes that ESLint error. Now, it's getting called many times, but each time, if it's called and count has changed, that effect is getting triggered again. A new interval is getting triggered, and it's actually going and getting updated because this is getting called again. So it's closing over the new value of count each time. And so you can see down here, what we're seeing is actually not just that the effect, or sorry, that the tick is getting called every second, but because this dependency is changing, the entire effect is getting called every time too. So for something where that effect is lightweight, not a big deal, right? But if you're doing something where maybe you're making an API call or something like that, or just a larger calculation, that's not ideal, because really we don't want to be calling the effect every second. What we want to be calling is just that interval. So it works, but it's not optimized, right? So moving on here, there's a couple issues too, because besides just being not optimal, it's also tricky to pull it out into a hook. So I'm going to go back here and let's start writing our useInterval hook. So it's going to take in a callback, and it's going to, let's for now keep it simple, take in a callback, and it's going to use a fixed delay. So in here, basically just take this code up here, and instead of doing our tick, we will call the callback. Okay. And right away, we can see that we have an issue, because here we're just being passed the callback. We're not being passed the dependencies. So when we do this, we want to have a dependency that will make the useEffect work, but it's not going to, because we don't have count in scope. So I'm going to take that out for right now. Let's see if we can get it working down here. So useInterval, take our function. Now, if we save it, so this is interesting. So basically what we're seeing is that nothing is happening. And you can see the reason why that is because it's back to that same problem that we had initially, where the effect is getting called many times. But what's not getting called is this, because the interval never gets a chance to complete, right? Before it gets a chance to get to 1,000 milliseconds, it's cleared and a new one is created. So this isn't really going to work for us, right? There's a couple ways we could go and do something like this and pass in depths. And down here, pass in count like that. And that can kind of work, but you can see that it's not very happy about it. For one thing, it doesn't actually let us go and check that the depth is properly set. So you can make this work, but it can't be statically analyzed or anything like that. So you're missing out on some things there. So we're getting closer, but it's still not a very effective function. And part of the issue here comes back to what we're seeing with the way that this is defined, right? So this useEffect gets triggered every time that these depths change. But the challenge here is that because we're passing those depths in, we're losing some of that static analysis. So if we take those out, then we have the problem that these are only ever going to be called once. And so it's not going to work for us anymore. So what we have to do is find out if there's a way to make it work with only calling that set interval once. And that's where something like useRef can be useful. So jumping forward a little bit, what we're going to start doing now is using useRef. And so when we define that callback function, what we're going to do, or sorry, that interval, what we're going to do is we're going to pass in a reference. And the cool things about references in the useRef hook is that it's stable between every render in React. And what that means is that when you go and whether you're calling it on the first render, like when the component first mounts, or the 100th render, whenever you call useRef, what you're going to get back is the same reference, or specifically to the reference's current value. And so you can use that as a way to pass values between different contexts, right? Where you have a value that is defined on the first render, like in a callback, and a value that's defined in the last one. So if we come here, we're going to add a new thing. Save the callback. Create a reference to it using the useRef. We have the import. Now you're going to call it. So down here, what we're going to do is when the callback comes in, instead of calling it directly from set interval, we're going to go and use another effect. What we'll do is when this is called, I've done something in my editor here. One moment. What have I done? So let me finish writing this code and then I'll reload. So what we're going to do is whenever useInterval is called, we're going to go and save that callback in a reference. So now, regardless of whether this is the first render or the 100th render, the current value of saved callback is going to be equal to whatever the callback was from the latest render. And down here, all we need to do is change this and go saved callback current, because we know that even though we are defining this, for example, on the first render, it's actually going to go, and every time it's called, it's going to get that same reference to the saved callback, and it can go and invoke the function that's in current. So I'm going to copy this. Let's reload this window and let's make sure it comes back. This is the problem with live demos. One moment, bear with me here. Oh, I've really broken the internet. Sorry. Okay, everyone bear with me for a moment. I'm sorry about this. I just needed a fresh window instead. Do this. So save callback current. So once again, I'm using that reference and I'm saving the callback into it. And then down here, I'm going to go and use that now for my callback. Okay, so this is ticking again. And I just want to kind of reiterate some of the points there because there's a couple subtle things that are happening. So when I said this before, the interval was getting set up the first time that this component mounts. But at that point, the callback was from the very first render, that initial mount and render. And so it was tied to any value that the callback had the first time it was rendered. By using the ref, I can kind of break that, right? And the cool thing with the ref is that regardless of whether it's the first or the 100th render, the ref.current value is always going to be the same. And so you can use that as a way to define, a closure or a function in your first render, and then go and update or change its value in subsequent renders. And by doing that, even though this interval and this closure is created during the first render and then updated on the 67th or 68th one, we know that the value of callback is going to be the current value from the latest render. Okay, so maybe I'll quickly pause here. Sorry for the demo issue there, but are there any questions about this, about how useRef lets you access things from different renders? Okay, give it one more second. Oh, okay, no questions. All right, so let's move on. So we're actually getting pretty close. So we now have a useInterval that works with the callback, but in here you can see that the set interval, we're always defaulting to 1,000 right now. So if we want to be able to go and make that work a little better, we'd like to be able to pass that in. So here, let's change that and that. Pass it in there. Yeah, it's going a little crazy. And we'll pass that in here. And then we actually need to go and pass in a value for that. So let's say, we'll start with 1,000. And it should go back to how it was. Yeah, 100 is a little faster and super fast. So we can hook that up to a state variable. And I actually called this one delay, even though it's the interval that's being set, because if we didn't, we would actually have set interval here, and set interval we don't want it to be both our setter function and our set interval at the global state. So I renamed it to delay. Okay. Why is this mad at me again? Apparently CodePen or Code Sandbox is having some trouble today. I apologize for that. I'm not sure what I've done here, but I may have to reload this window again. Okay, there we go. We're going to add it back in our delay so that we can change it. And we'll have to have a handler just so that we can update that value. So I'll call it handle delay change. And simple function. And all it does is an our event and then call set delay with the event target dot value. I think I remember that right. Oh, it's just so mad at me. Jeez. I'm sorry. I don't know why this didn't come up when I was doing my demo earlier. Okay, so now I should be able to do as we were at the start and go and update this and should see, oh, if I pass in delay, we should see it speed up. There we go. All right, so we've got it working again. So now there's one other thing that we could do to improve this. So right now, it's making this fairly lightweight call to go and update that ref. If we were being really picky, this isn't optimal because we would want to optimize this to do it whenever callback changes, right? To do that, then in here, saving callback. Get rid of that tick so we can see this. So you can see it's actually calling save callback a lot. And so the reason why is something to do with the way that we've defined our tick function here. And what that is that when this app is rendered, every time it renders, it's going to pass this function into useInterval. But one of the things that you'll see about hooks is that they use something called object.is to go and compare two objects together. And one of the things that you'll see is that for a function, there's no two functions where object.is are going to be the same if you're just defining them. The only way that they're going to be the same is if it's actually one definition that is only defined once. It doesn't matter if they have the same kind of structure and content. If they're defined twice, they're going to be different and they'll never be equal. So let's go back here. So you can see it's still calling that like crazy. And this is where another hook that can be useful comes in. So there's one called use callback. If we want to use that, we come in here and we're going to do mode. And this is where we use callback again. And what we're going to do is basically take this function here, drop it in, and then this has depths just like we do for useEffect, and its depth is count. Now it's going to go and depend on that, and here we're going to pass in our tick instead. Sorry, memoed. Oh, I might have spelled it wrong. Oh, I'm very frustrated by this tonight. I don't know why it's not working better. I used this for my last demo and it was fine. Oh, is it mad at me for my spelling? Definitely seems like something is locking up the JavaScript. I've done this correctly, hopefully. So yeah, so now you can see the difference is instead of saving the callback every time it's rendered, what you can do, what you can do is go and use something like a use callback there to make sure that the callback is only redefined when its dependencies change. So that's it. I think we've hit pretty much every optimization we can do for this. We have a nice callback function or hook, excuse me, that we can use. It'll take in the callback and the delay. It'll optimize both of them, only updating the callback when it changes and only updating the interval when the delay changes. So we've hit a lot of things there. And the biggest things that we've learned is that when you're rendering, whenever you go and the render function is called, if you have new functions like our tick that are defined within it, when you do that, you are going to close over whatever the current values are for that function invocation. And so if you want to be able to go and access values from different renders, what you're going to want to do is use something like a useRef and use that to create a stable value that is stable between different renders so that things from your first render, like when we set interval, are able to go and continue to access the latest value from the 100th render by doing that. So if you have any questions, let me know. Okay, so I see a question from Nico. When you say render, are we talking like HTML pages? Yeah, a good question. So basically, what we're talking about there is the React rendering lifecycle. And that sounds all fancy, but basically what it is in here, right? This is what we call a React function component, right? It's a function that runs, and at the end of it, we're going to return some JSX or React DOM elements to display. And so React goes, and it's smart enough that it will call that whenever it needs to drop new markup into the DOM. And it's also smart enough to go and say, look at things like your state values and your effects and call that function again to render new markup when they change. And so every time that React calls your function to render new markup, we say that's a render. And React is actually what's determining when those happen based off changes to the state, based off kind of whatever it decides, basically. Like sometimes you'll see that if the state changes, it won't render and it'll save those up and batch them, it's called, so that it'll maybe if there's 100 changes in a millisecond, it will save those and go and just render once to optimize the performance there. So when we talk about a render, what we're talking about basically is React calling your function. And the important thing there is that when it's rendered, by default, every single one of those renders is like a clean slate, right? And so what that means is that the first render and the second render are not the same and don't really have any understanding of each other. And the way that we can get around that is by using some of our hooks. And so specifically the use state ones, that you carry state from one render to the next. The useEffect ones can take in some dependencies there, so they can kind of play off that state to decide whether they need to run again. And then useRef is cool because it lets you directly tie into that and say, basically, I want to have a value that I'm going to pull out of that rendering. And whenever I call useRef, it's going to go and return the same value, regardless of whether it's the first time that function is called or the 100th time. So I hope that helps answer your question. But yeah, if you have any questions, please let me know. Yeah, no problem, Nico.
We have a question from Alex I. He's going to be asking it in the chat in just a second. There's just confusion how you ask questions.
Oh yeah, no worries. Thank you. So I'm still taking JS in school right now. This looks quite similar to what I have been learning the last week. What is React? Sorry, that is not a stupid question at all. That is a good question. So React is, let me pull up their website. 1 second. So great question. And it can be pretty intimidating when you first start, to be honest. So do not sweat it at all. Ask as many questions as you want. Basically what it is it is a library for building, they say, JavaScript user interfaces. So most people are going to use React to build interfaces for websites, but you can also use things like React Native to build Android and iPhone apps, and Windows and Mac now, I think, too. There's also other kind of rendering things that will let you render even to stuff like the command line and things like that. But React originally was based around these classes, where you would have a class that would go and it would get rendered by React and had different methods that would get called throughout its life cycle. But probably 3-4 years ago, they made the switch to mostly using functional components. And what they are is they are functions that you call which return JavaScript DOM objects. And so they're cool because they're much easier to test. It's kind of whatever comes in, you're always going to get a consistent thing out. But they didn't have any ability to use state until React hooks were added. And so what state is a way to go and kind of save a value that you can pass between those different calls to your function, right? So when you look at something like this, so this whole thing is your functional component, because it's a function that down here returns some JSX, which is kind of fancy React HTML. Up here, these things like use state, use callback, though use interval is the one we just made. Those are all React hooks. You can always tell it's a hook because it starts with use something. That's kind of just the convention, but linting tools understand that too. And so this one here is really important because it lets you share state between renders. So when you call it, you get back the current value of the state, as well as a function that you can use to change the value of that state. So down here in our kind of callback here, we call set count, and we take in the current value, we add one to it. That's how we set the new one. And the cool thing there is that React will go and look for calls to those functions and say, okay, I know that this component has changed its state, so I need to call it again to update and to re-render. So basically, React handles doing a lot of those in an optimal way and rendering an interface for you. No, though, so that's a good question. Nico was asking if functions like useState and useInterval are part of React or they're custom written. So right here, this is the React hooks page. I encourage you to read this. Honestly, React has spent a lot of time on their docs. They have this whole section on hooks and what they are. So this is the API page. This is not where I would probably start. But there's 3 basic hooks: use state, use effect, and use context. Those are, pretty much the basic ones that you should understand. Some of the ones in this talk are a bit more advanced. So we use callback, use ref. There's other ones too. Use reducer can be handy if you have complicated state that you're kind of manipulating and changing and stuff, but a bit more complicated than what we would typically use for a simple app. Same with use memo. It's both use callback and use memo are something that you would use to optimize a lot of the time. So I'm hitting over half an hour here. So if you want me to stop,
Yeah,
I'm happy to take questions after.
I was just coming to say that, like, love the questions. I think this might be a good place to kind of put a pin in it for now. We'll have tables afterwards where you can maybe answer some of these questions. And I know that if you head to the JavaScript community as in DevEdmonton, we'd be happy to help answer some of these questions or point you at the docs, which are really good.
Totally. Can I just say quickly too, I assume a lot of people have done this already or something similar, but I'm sure people are aware of the crisis in Ukraine right now. If you're able, there's lots of people and lots of different ways to help. But yes, I just wanted to encourage everyone to think on that. And if there's something you can do, please do so, because I think there's a lot of people who would benefit.
Yeah. Thanks, Mark. That's a fantastic point.
I will stop sharing my screen now. Thanks, Ian.
Yeah. I'm just going to try and find my slides here, which have vanished off the side of my computer here. I don't need slides to introduce the next guest. The next guest is Daniel Zhou, who's going to be telling us all about ESLinters and helping us to build a compiler. Haha, he's shown up. Daniel.
Hey there. It's good to be here. Hey, yeah. I guess I'll just head right into the thing
Absolutely.
here.
Take it away.
Yeah. So can you get? Oh, you guys are probably getting just a wall of how does this work? Okay, cool. Just a quick check. I'm coming off of like of my browser. Can you guys see the slides okay? Or is it like focused on the window or the screen, or how does that look? Hello? Okay, so it looks like you guys can see that. Cool. Okay, so that's good. So yeah, so hey there. My name is Daniel Zhou, and I'm here today to talk a little bit about ESLinting, making and breaking our own linters. But to start out, a little bit about me. I graduated and I work inside the city essentially, and currently I'm getting the opportunity to explore some areas of interests that interest me, and being able to tie that to some of my work into it, more so as a backend developer now than previously, where I used to do a lot more full stack stuff, and a combination of stuff involving React, Cypress for web testing, and developer tooling. So the topic for today revolves around code linters, and at the core of it, code linters is just this program that checks your programs for stylistic errors, and we typically call these a static analysis tool, in the sense that it doesn't necessarily run your code. It more or less just makes inferences based on the structure of it. So first and foremost, I guess the plan for the day is kind of 2 parts. So it sounds like today we have a bit of or rather, this talk for today will be a bit of an introduction to what are linters, why you should use them, how you should use them, types of things. And then what I hope to be 70% of the talk will be this subject of how do I actually extend a linter? How do I tailor the rules that a linter implements for my organization, or for my domain, or for my particular use case? So yeah. So first and foremost, code linting. How do we use them? First and foremost, it's mostly through IDE integrations, and you can probably find one for, say, for example, VS Code as per here, or the command line as per here. And generally, we talk about linter benefits, and in terms of this idea that they'll probably increase the quality or the behaviors of your code, or the styling, the conventions, the formatting associated. But Implicit to all that is two things that I wanted to highlight here. Is that linters are a great tool for kind of enforcing a particular rule or a particular convention on your entire repo or sets of repos. And that being said, it saves a lot of time in this guaranteed code coverage type of perspective. And in part, stemming off of that, it's a great way to also to generate knowledge sharing or knowledge discoveries, for instance. So, if you're learning about a new language or you're learning about a new framework or library, as we'll see in a second here, onboarding the linting configurations can be pretty helpful, even if you don't care about necessarily the fixes, the code quality checks, or the styling. Maybe you disagree with them. Nevertheless, it's kind of an interesting tool to share those practices around. So yeah, so setting up a linter is as easy as adding a dependency inside your dependency manager, running through a little setup process, and setting up some configurations. Yeah, I wanted to kind of get through a little bit of this so we can have a bit of more time to take a look at the actual implementing of a linter or rather linter rule. So as a prelude to that, just as a first pass of thing, what do linters actually do? What does this linting program actually do to check your source files? Well, the general process looks a bit like this. We have source files. Source files are converted into this intermediate representation, which we'll call this an abstract syntax tree. It's essentially converting your source file into the grammatical structure and contents. And once we have this tree representation, the linter can then apply various rules and such to check that tree, and thereby checking your source code to output warnings, suggestions, automated fixes, or just regular suggestions, and being able to locate particularly which file at which line at which column the linter rule is fired off of. Um, so yeah, so that's that. I figured I'll pause for a second here to take a look at the comments just to check if anything's going on there. And as a transition from moving from this overarching process of linting, I wanted to get us started about thinking about what are some particular use cases of linters that we might like to implement, and the generalization of that, which I'll call this idea of domain-specific linting. Typically, when we onboard something like ESLint, the linting tool for JavaScript, for instance, the default rule sets and the such are typically focused on these very general bits of code or small formatting quirks or something of the such. But I wanted to highlight that we can onboard additional linting plugins and modules for more specialized use cases. For instance, maybe you're doing an accessibility audit for your code base, and thereby you can onboard say something like this JSX Ally plugin for ESLint to check JSX. And likewise, maybe you're onboarding React and you like to check for best practices or practices as recommended by the authors of this particular React plugin. You can, and this goes for a variety of subjects and a variety of libraries and frameworks and such. And from there, I just want to recap on the benefits. You get automatic fixes, you get complete coverage over your repo, and you also get the knowledge sharing, the implicitness of this. So you're not handing someone a big rule book about React or something like that they have to read and internalize. The practices can be shared at the time they are needed, which is quite nice. So yeah, so that being said, let's take a look into making our own rules and linters by extending ESLint. So the plugin work. So the plan for actually setting up our linter will be something like the following. We'll do most of the actual linter building or rule building via this tool called Ast Explorer online in the browser. And as part of that, we'll walk through a couple of concepts here. Firstly, let's understand a little bit about the ESLint architecture. I have a little demo scenario, and by tailoring this rule to our little demo scenario here, we can get a bit of an understanding of what goes on inside a ESLint rule. So yeah, so at a high level, the ESLint architecture, we can just break down that into three major components. Firstly, we have rules being individual practices or problematic snippets of code we'd like to validate against the source code and thereby validate that against this abstract syntax tree generated by the linter for your source code. We have plugins, which is the unit of distribution and the unit people typically work with, in the sense that these are just rules and configurations packaged for ESLint. They're the things that you're downloading or that you're downloading off of npm to use as an add-on to the actual linter itself. And lastly, we have the linter, which is in this case, the Linter Engine, the thing that's taking the rules and plugins to run. And I'll note that like when we think about the linter, we can think about the fact that there are multiple places that this Linter Engine actually runs on, such as the command line, such as the IDE integrations, and such as the Node API for ESLint. So yeah, so the problem for our linter for today is something as follows. Imagine we're making some sort of front end application or UI via React, and we'd like to onboard Cypress for automated end-to-end testing. And in doing so, Cypress likes to define their own data.cy identifiers to create a little test interface, so that when you select things from the UI in Cypress, when you're trying to script your tests like that, Cypress has a very robust and unique set of attributes to do that from. If this is kind of your use case in the real world, this can be fairly tedious to manually scan at the end of your React code base, right? So let's see if we can make a ESLint rule to set a convention to say that if we have event listeners such as on-click or on-change handlers, then we need to have an associated data.cy attribute as well. And if we can't think of one, let's give people the ability to generate these so that we can kind of quickly label a whole bunch of interactive components and get them started on onboarding this testing tool as well. So yeah, so I have some sample source code. This is going back to React functional, React class-based components. This will be kind of the demo code to load into Ast Explorer. So let's jump over to that tab over here. Close this bottom panel for now, and to take a look at what is going on inside here. So Ast Explorer is one of these little, code editor sites types of things, but it is geared towards exploring the syntax tree for a variety of these languages and such, a variety of parsers and transformers. And so going from that, we have some demo source code on the left, and we have its syntax tree representation on the right. And this site makes it really easy to be able to explore this tree to figure out the components that you'd want to examine in the event that you want to make a rule or something like that. So it helps you figure out the structural details. Of the language and of the instances that you'd like to check there. So just as a quick overview of what we're seeing here, just to anchor some things. So on the left here we have a typical file, I'd say, in JavaScript. It has some import declarations, it has a class declaration, has some variable and function declarations. And that being said, there is a fairly good, one-to-one mapping between the the source code here and the syntax tree elements here, especially noting to the fact that we can just kind of highlight elements around here. And well, going back to my demo problem, I wanted to take a look into event handlers, so things like this on change and on click prop handle like type of thing. So let's take a look inside this class, right? Like decoration. Let's see whether or not we can drill down inside here to find where these identifiers are actually being declared. So I've obviously already done that ahead of time. It seems like these prop names are JSX identifiers in the language of Babel/ESLint, and they belong in pairs with respect to the actual handler as a JSX attribute from the looks of things. And it looks like these JSX attributes sit inside a JSX opening element and then finally a JSX element. So going from there, we've kind of identified the individual snippet of code here that's relevant to us from the perspective of the source file in its entirety and also its syntax tree representation, right? So from here, we can think about actually developing a little role here to transform or to identify this particular code structure or bit, and to suggest a fix if possible. So I'll pause here again. I'll tab back to the chat here and see if anyone has any questions, comments, or concerns. Alex wanted me to zoom in a bit. We can try to do that. So bump that to 150-ish. So yeah, so how is that? So, expanding the layout here, let's take a look at what's going on inside the bottom two quadrants here. So left to right again, on the left, we have a ESLint rule, and on the right, we have the outputs from the ESLint rule, whether that be messages being emitted or a fixed version of the source code file, or rather a fixes applied version of the source code file. So going back to the original here, going back to my class-based component and the problem, I wanted to automatically generate one of these data.cy tags for these interactive components if they didn't already have them. And by the input output of the I suppose the second to fourth panels over here, we can see that inside this transformed version, I'm able to generate a little hyphenated data.cy tag, with the first element being something I wanted to demonstrate something dynamic. So I've set that to be the name of the JSX element, and then the suffix to be just a random unique, hopefully unique 4-character identifier. So we can see that here. This version doesn't have that, and this one does. So yeah, so that gives us a good place to tackle what is actually going on inside this particular ESLint rule. So yeah, I think I'll try to I'll try to avoid doing it here because yeah, I recognize the font might be a bit problematic. Let's go back to the slides for now, and I think I'll break down the elements that we see inside VS Code instead, perhaps. Diving into actually implementing an ESLint rule, I'm going to do this as a series of iterations or as a series of levels, and gradually unpack the constructs required or being used inside of ESLint rule. So I guess we'll take a look at the rule over here inside this inside the demo repo I've made for this. And I think the first thing I'll do here is that I'll actually fold all of the code chunks inside here so we can take a look at this. Like I said, level by level, starting from the outer ones and going down from there. And at the onset, a rule for ESLint is actually just this export of two items. A module that exports two items, some metadata and some resources for the rule, and what I'll call what I'll call the create context function over here. So jumping back to the slides, let's kind of discuss these more in depth, rather just more so of the latter. So essentially, a rule is going to define a whole bunch of validator functions and a whole bunch of validator rather a whole bunch of validator of a whole bunch of abstract syntax tree selectors and a whole bunch of validator functions. The create callbacks function is this thing that essentially generates a set of syntax tree selectors and validator functions, and this will be essentially the implementation of our rule. The linter manages traversing the actual source code syntax tree. It'll maintain that traversal, and it will dispatch callback functions, validator callback functions, I guess would be an apt way of putting them, on pieces of the abstract syntax tree as required or as requested by our linting rule. And that takes us into the callback level. How are we actually defining the validator functions and the selectors inside this create callbacks function? So inside here we can start off by doing essentially whatever we want, and I define the helper function, and I also define the validator function. So we'll take a look at the individual details in the third level, but for the time being, let's just take a look at what this rule actually returns to the linter, and it returns this, well, like I said, this object of mapping abstract syntax tree selectors to a particular validator function. Breaking that down, the abstract syntax tree selectors are a bit like CSX selectors for the DOM tree. Fundamentally, one thing manipulates the contents, the HTML for your web page. The syntax tree now doubles as that essentially, but only for your source code file. Um, so essentially, the purpose of this is to define kind of interesting bits of the source code file for our validator functions to start at, and just to emphasize that it's the starting point. You can do your own traversal, and you can really do whatever you want as part of that validator function. But the selector looks something like this, and we've seen a fair amount of the selectors already from the Ast Explorer website. And that's kind of in part why I like using that site. So these can be as simple, or these are relatively straightforward. They can be something as simple as like function declaration or a JSX element, but they can also be complex or composite selectors, just as per CSS selectors, such as something like this. I'm interested in calling the validator function on JSX elements being direct descendants of function declarations, or the direct thing inside function declarations. So yeah, so there's that. The validator function is, just the actual running bits of code to check, to trigger to check, starting from whatever your abstract syntax tree selector may pick up. And yeah, the linter will simply call this function, being passed the node of interest. So, in the context of our rule, where we're picking up these on-click and on-change handlers, we saw that the main thing of interest here is really that I think the exist inside of JSX element, and they are a JSX identifier here. I think I can just double click on on this section as well, and yeah, that'll also pull it up, right? So following that pattern, I've made two selectors that I call a common validator function on. So here we take a look. So here we're using that that compound type of selector method where I'm specifically picking up JSX identifiers with a name attribute of being on change and on click respectively, and then passing those nodes to this validate JSX function. So going into here takes us into the third level of this ESLint rule, and that is where the level here within the validator function is essentially interfaces to the ESLint linter itself. First and foremost, we get this context object from the overarching closure of this create context function here. And this is a mechanism to do two things. One is grabbing contextual information about the source code file and the surrounding linting process, but more importantly, it provides this functionality here, this context.report method to report particular parts of your source code as being problematic, or it triggers a warning or something of that such. And you do so by passing the particular node, so it knows where it is, a message and some message parameters if you'd like. And if you think you can fix this bit of, this bit of source code automatically, you can then supply a fixer function to do that, which leads to the last kind of concept we have to take a look at, which is this fixer interface. So ESLint gives you a limited ability to make changes to the actual source code file to suggest that as an automated fix. And that said, it'll call a callback function that you define here with that as a sort of a limited fixing interface, and I want to stress the limited portion there because it's not really meant to, it's not really geared to, nor is it meant to kind of make to kind of make sweeping changes. You can do a little bit here and there, but not too much. So yeah, so that's kind of that. I guess we'll take a look at the contents here for this validator rule, just as a um, yeah, as a stepping point for taking a look at the integrations and to explore the validator function level concepts here. So this is a pretty simple rule. We're just going to check whether or not a given JSX element with an identifier of onClick or onChange already has this data.cy element where this associated attribute. If it doesn't, we'll suggest one. If not, then it's already good. So that's that, or rather the other way around. So what I do here, so what I'm doing inside here is I'm pulling out the JSX opening element, and I'm going to do a map on it, where I'm going to do a sum on it to map out whether or not it has this data.cy attribute on one of its name on one of its attributes, and if it doesn't, I'm going to use context.report to report it as being problematic. And if it is, I'm going to supply this fixture function. So yeah, making these requires a fair amount of use, I find, with trying to prototype your rule out somewhere here, and in the process exploring a bit of the syntax tree, right? So in the implementation I've described to you, what I'm essentially doing is that I'm taking a look, starting from this JSX identifier, as per requested by my syntax tree selector. I'm bouncing up to grab the handle for the JSX opening element, and I'm checking all of the attributes here to see whether or not it has that data.cy placeholder, right? Or just rather the first part here. This can be named anything we'd like. So yeah, so that's kind of that. And going from there, inside this fixer, I'm taking this fixer interface, and all I'm doing is that I'm just injecting essentially this data.cy string, template string, just slightly before the location of our on-click handler within the source code. So yeah, so that is just a quick overview of that. I'll pop back in over here and guess since no questions, we'll just continue with that here. So yeah, so that kind of wraps up. Oh, sorry. I forgot about demoing that inside the IDE and the such over here. So what I've done for the code snippets and the bits for the presentation stuff here is that I've made a very simple React app, and I've made the rule as a npm package, whereas as a plugin containing one rule for the purpose of this of this presentation, and I've added them to this demo React app as a developer dependency. So there's that. There is our ESLint plugin. I've named it after the Meetup Exchange.js, and it's just some being hosted locally. I'm I've kind of defined our ESLint configs in line, just because I'm lazy, and I've set it to trigger our suggest IDs rule. So if we take a look at inside our source code here, I'm getting the yellow or red squiggly lines here. I've defined this little starting here, or this this little helper message, and from here I get all the usual ESLint in interfacing with VS Code. So for example, from here, I can just select, quick fix fix this particular issue, and I can inject these data.cy props or automation IDs accordingly. And likewise, from the command line, I can just run your typical run ESLint types of things to get the fixes in a alternative format as per here. So yeah, so that is kind of a working example of prototyping the rule via Ast Explorer, seeing kind of the integrations in progress here. So the last thing is to take a look at the how does it work from the opposite side? How does it work from the lint the ESLinter plugin side of things? So if I go into the the node modules here for the sake of convenience, find our linting plugin. This plugin will be a very simple set. It'll be, in a sense, a very simple set of just these three files. We have a package.json typical file, describing the fact that this is a ESLint plugin for Exchange.js. Our suggest data IDs rule, which is the file I've been viewing is in here all along, and a index for this lib folder, which actually defines this as the suggest IDs plugin. It's a plugin composed of one rule here, the suggest IDs rule. I'm supplying it with this TypeScript parser just because that's the parser I'm familiar with. And inside here, I'm also providing a recommended set of configurations, just to show that, yeah, that's also one thing that you can do here. So yeah, so that is a comprehensive example of kind of, prototyping the rules, getting it set up, running inside inside a typical environment here, and actually kind of applying some of the fixes as is. I guess going back to the slides, yeah, a little bit about how this kind of ties to my day-to-day work. So I found the motivation for the talk and the motivation for learning about technology came from working as a full stack developer, implementing some tests and the such. And as it turns out, when I moved towards more so backend development and stuff like that, I picked up developer tooling as one of the things that I'm passionate about, and it's one of the things that I'm leading inside Intuit. Intuit's it's a large developer organization. There's 3,000 some developers, and at this scale, knowledge sharing between teams, organizations, locations, the fact that people rotate in and out can become quite a challenge. And for the reasons I mentioned a bit earlier about knowledge discovery and about sharing implicit best practices, I believe that things like linters can be a great tool for taking out some of that cognitive load for improving the developer experience and kind of automating a lot of the tedium from it. So as part of that, I guess talking about the first three of these active areas, I am working on some more fleshed out versions of linters such as this for test automation for Cypress. I'm also looking at it for the purpose of internationalization or globalization, seeing if we can make a tailored ESLint rule for UI libraries and the such, so that we can kind of detect hard-coded UI content and to streamline the process of kind of taking a product from, say, the US market, reusing some of the business logic from it, and packaging it for other countries, Canada and the such in there. So yeah, it's kind of exciting working inside these two domains. And overall, I found that one interesting thing about building all of these developer tools, these linting things, is that the hardest part of this, I say, wouldn't necessarily be making the individual rules themselves, but it's actually driving adoption within your organization to get people on board and to get people to use this type of custom ruling. And currently, I'm at the phase where I'm comfortable releasing like a point 0.9 type of beta. It's a good place where I think I'd be more interested in trying to get some early adopters and to get some feedback going for them so far. And stemming from that, there's three kind of cool areas that this work translates into. For one, to make the developer experience even easier, we don't actually even have to make linters, this developer dependency with setups and initializations and such like that. We can also investigate this idea of just making these npx linters, I'll call them, where everything's prepackaged and you can just type like npx run this linter instead, and it'll download the thing as a package, run it once, and then the thing will just I guess just disappear, like the create React app type of workflow there. Another kind of takeaway for me was taking a look at doing some I/O and working with the ESLint node API. And I wanted to touch on two things here. So for globalization and for externalizing content, you need to work outside of the direct file you're linting. And this creates some problems because from the perspective of the linter rule, you can't actually do that. And in fact, you can't actually do any I/O unless you're running your own process and you're just wrapping the linting engine and bouncing stuff back and forth to the linter engine just as is. And yeah, I wanted to highlight this because it's something notable, especially if you wanted to capture some observability metrics from your linting processes or something of the such or that sort. And it highlights some good food for thought, I think, in the sense that, hey, like, what makes running these rules that are actively checking my source code kind of secure from a broader perspective? Why can't someone just make a linter rule to essentially copy all of my source code? For instance, and as it turns out, there's no real IO going on just as part of the linting architecture here, so you're very safe and isolated from that, which is quite nice. And lastly, I just wanted to point out that because of how the create callbacks type of functionality works, you're actually able to generate rules dynamically. And I'll leave the dynamically from part up to you because depending on your organizational needs and the such like that, sometimes you can use rule generation to empower developers to set up their own rules in very comprehensive setup combinations, especially since you know making static analysis tooling or even taking a like compilers course isn't something that I've done. So giving people the flexibility to adapt those tools is important. And the second thing is that in my case, I'm for detecting hard-coded content, I'm only checking essentially React props for a well-defined UI library already. So I can actually pin the rule to the version of that library if I know for a fact that, say, for example, all of my UI libraries is components take things like label or placeholder or warning message as pretty consistent indications that, hey, these will be UI facing strings or content pieces of the such like that. So yeah, so that is my presentation at a glance. Ask me about the following things, or if you want to chat, I'd love to as well. So yeah, thank you for listening.
Thank you. That's very thorough. I don't think we have any real questions in the chat from what I've been able to see. It definitely a lot of praise for your talk, very thorough. And I think you did a really good job of sharing the reasons why someone might want to use linting rules, right? That organizational perspective as well as that coding standards perspective, I think really valuable. So thank you very much for your contributions to the meeting tonight.
You're welcome. Happy to be here.
Absolutely. I don't know what to say after an amazing
yeah,
presentation.
yeah, me too.
Like, I think linters are one of those things that we always kind of take for granted. It just kind of makes all of our code better, but to learn about them in this way is really valuable. So I am going to turn on my screen, and it doesn't appear that my screen sharing is working. Give me a second here. I might have to just, let me refresh.
Oh, gee. I guess in the meantime, to fill some time, yeah, I just wanted to highlight Alex's point there. Yeah, like one thing about these linting rules and the such like that is, um, yeah, and I've been having this conversation at work. I think just as a best practices on making ESLint rules that may enforce best practices. Yeah, I would echo the opinion that like, hey, these are arguably kind of flimsy rule implementations, right? So I would definitely suggest make them warnings, make them optional as best as you can, rather than making them some sort of build breaking or error triggering type of things. But yeah, I'll hand it back to Ian.
Yeah. Good note on that idea of the rule breaking thing. If you're going to have that, it's best to loop that into like a prettier type situation, right? So you can find how you want that to break on its own, right? Make it automated. If it's going to break something, make it fix itself in an automated manner.
Yes.
Right. Cool. I will. My sharing is not working. I'm just going to go out. You can imagine my slides. I'm just going to, you can stop sharing your screen if you want, Daniel, or you can accompany me here on the end of this. Either way, it doesn't really matter. So that was our meetup for March. Thank you everyone for attending. Some fantastic talks. Again, all this is going to be up on YouTube. There was a lot of questions about React and some other kind of more foundational JavaScript questions. If any of those people are still in the audience, I would say that the tables at Remo are probably the best way to get a quick answer to that. We can maybe answer some more of those kind of basic questions. Again, most of the people here are pretty darn approachable in terms of answering questions and being friendly to people who are a little bit newer. Other than that, the DevEdmonton Society is always a good resource. And it is a fantastic place to ask questions, especially with like a really supportive group of developers and all sorts of different kind of digital people. We have data scientists on there, a whole bunch of different developer adjacent type roles as well, managers, all those sorts of things. So it's a fantastic place for us to go. But this event doesn't happen by just a couple of people in a room together deciding to do something. We have wonderful sponsors. The three companies that I will shout out for our sponsors currently would be Punchcard. They are a place that's near and dear to my heart because I used to work there. It does software consulting, and they do like all sorts of web apps, mobile apps, SharePoint, lots of document portal type stuff. And they're really active in the community as well. The people over at Punchcard are fantastic, and I recommend them highly. The next person on my list is Jobber, a local Edmonton success story that's growing. We're at almost 600 people now, which is crazy considering the fact that we were 300 2 years ago. So it's growing a lot. They do small business solutions, building software for people that are running their own business, that sort of stuff. And then the last one would be Iron Sights, a local consulting firm that does mostly oil field and logistical kind of tracking software for oil field type situations and like larger businesses and stuff. Really great guys there as well. Also really interested and really active in the DevEdmonton community. There's lots of former and current Iron Sight people running around. The next thing that I will shill for is Startup Edmonton. This account that we're using right now, this isn't free. This software that lets us meet at tables and do presentations and record all that stuff. All of this is based out of Startup Edmonton's generosity. They have an account and they've let DevEdmonton use it for the past several years. These events wouldn't be happening without DevEdmonton. And we hope at some point to go back to the wonderful world that you see kind of reflected in the abstract of Remo to their actual physical location. They lately have been soliciting feedback based on their new space, because DevEdmonton is part of a whole rebranding, a whole relaunching of those companies to better help digital innovation around Edmonton. I would encourage you to reach out to Startup Edmonton. They're a fantastic resource to use if you ever want to figure out like, hey, how do I launch a company? How do I do that sort of stuff? And then the last thing that I will mention before I sign off for the evening and put us back into the table so we can all have that kind of group discussion is the fact that our next meetup is going to be on the 13th. Is it 13th or 14th? Oh my goodness. 14th of April, he said, definitely not checking his slides, definitely remembering that it was the 14th of April. So that'd be the second Thursday of April. We're going to be going back to the first Thursday of each month in May going forward, likely. Keep an eye on the channels Meetup-Ruby and Meetup-JavaScript to figure out when we're going to be. But you've all had enough of people talking at you, and everyone's been so quiet and so wonderful and all that stuff. So let's go back to the tables. Thank you again to our wonderful presenters. Thank you to our organizers, and thank you to all of our attendees for making this another very successful meetup. I will see everyone in the tables in just a couple of seconds. Bye.